Welcome to today's provocation. We are joined by Katie and Eero from the Imperial College London, and they're going to be talking about 22 reasons why we should not use the word decolonise. I, for one, am very excited to hear this provocation. Carry on.
So I am Katie Stripe. I'm a learning designer by trade, with an interest in inclusive learning, and Eero is my colleague who is a neuroscientist, and she will be managing the chat for me through this session. So for any of you that haven't used Mentimeter before, I'm presenting through Mentimeter, which is online. You can log in with the code at the top of the screen at the moment. I assume everybody can see my screen. Should have checked. Perfect. So I'm going to go through the slides on Mentimeter, and I'm going to ask you some questions. Just go with your first reaction. Don't overthink things. Just say what comes to mind. As was introduced, this is 22 reasons why we shouldn't use the word decolonise. I'm not actually going to provide you with 22 reasons, although I probably could. This has come from my master's thesis, which came up with 22 recommendations to make teaching more inclusive. And this is broadly about why decolonisation wasn't one of them. So throughout, I am going to say some things which might be challenging. Some of them I agree with, some of them I am just saying to be challenging. In the corner of your screen, there is a little speech bubble icon. If you click on that at any time, you should be able to challenge me or share comments, and then we'll collect them at the end, and Eero will be able to moderate them, so we can have a bit more of a broad discussion. If that's not working for you, you can pop them in the chat as well, but if you can do them through Mentimeter, that would help me, because that means I get to keep them. So, what is a colony? A group of people that settle in a new territory but remain very much a part of their own country or community, group of people with the same interests, or a group of animals or plants. So my first question, gut instincts, please. Can colonies or colonisation be a good thing? There's almost a 50-50 split. Interesting. Interesting. More yeses than nos. I wasn't expecting that. We're going to have to come back to this. So, I mean, yes, colonies can be a good thing because mole rats, penguins, ants. My point generally being that language, particularly English, is extremely nuanced, and it's important that we understand when we're talking about things like this, we understand what we're actually talking about and what we mean by colonies, decolonisation, all of these words. So another gut reaction, please. Colonisation has had a positive effect on education. If you can move your slider to the negative or the positive. So we're verging towards the quite strongly negative effects, even though we were quite happy that colonisation could be a good thing. I think it's also important when we're talking about these things to remember that colonialism isn't a Western construct. Many large cultures around the world throughout history have been fairly major in the taking over and colonizing other areas. We, as Western cultures, tend to think a lot about the Greek Empire, but the Persian Empire at the same time was much, much bigger. So what decolonization actually means, if you're looking at the dictionary, it means to grant independence to a colony. But what does it actually mean in the educational context? So you should be able to type in your thoughts on your second devices and share with me what you think it means in your context or in an educational context. Any more? These are great answers. I see quite a few people agreeing with my general approach to decolonisation. Okay. So I think, as was probably evident from the title of my talk, I have a little bit of a problem with the idea of decolonising. So from Musafi, the questions that arise are, is it even really possible? Who is really privileged? Who is excluded? And are we in fact recolonising the global south and stealing their ideas? Which, if you want to dig further into that, I suggest you read that paper, because I'm not entirely certain I fully understood where he was coming from with that. But again, it's about challenging what might be kind of accepted or understood by a certain term and thinking about it slightly more broadly. For me, it's the focus on geography that I find is the biggest problem, although from some of your comments, it doesn't seem like there is always a focus on geography. It's more than reading lists, and prejudice, exclusion, bias are much wider than just a geographic term. And are the underlying systemic problems that we have in higher education, are they actually being changed or challenged by the decolonisation agenda? So white people are not a global majority by a long way. The oldest universities in the global south were probably built by colonialists. China is kind of an outlier in the way we look at this, because it doesn't really fit in any of the kind of terms that we use: global north, global south, west. China has major impact in the academic sphere, certainly in science, but isn't necessarily reflected in the decolonisation agenda. And I think a big thing is that higher education in the global north, for want of a better phrase, represents scholars from everywhere around the world. We have a huge number of international students, international faculty members that are represented in our institutions. So my thoughts on challenging this are, first of all, to start with yourself. So think about how you, as someone working in higher education, identifies. Could be things on this list, it could be many more things. But the first thing for me is just to understand yourself and where you sit in kind of the inclusive, diverse space of your institution. So thinking about how you identify and what those major features of your personality, yourself, are. How often do you see yourself, versions of yourself? in an academic content. It's really interesting and actually quite depressing. Bear in mind, I have no idea what the demographic of the room I'm talking to looks like. This is quite sad in some ways, I think, that there are people that don't necessarily feel represented. Which means your students probably also feel the same way, but 24% of students in the UK are from overseas, and the majority of those are from outside of Europe. So we have a big, diverse student cohort, and we can bring their experiences into our classrooms. We can use their backgrounds and their cultures to make teaching and learning in higher education more inclusive and more open to a wider range of students. I would also strongly recommend that you find someone in your institution with a different perspective that can review your content, can be used as a sounding board, and ask yourself who you're including or excluding when you're creating content. Not just if your course is colonial or if it needs to be decolonised. But finally, the biggest thing for me is to reflect. Everything I've said, challenging or otherwise, they're ideas. And I am, to an extent, making challenging statements because I think we need to think about them. The only real question for your course is the content you develop is if you have reflected on it and you can ethically and pedagogically justify the content that you are presenting. If it's right for you and right for your students, then metrics like colonialism are not always the most important thing to do. So my final question, is it possible? There's a lot of yeses there. Okay, so overwhelmingly, yes, decolonisation is possible. Something else we may come back to. So the final thought before we go on, and we will open up the room to address the comments and challenges that you've left. For me, it's about representation. It's about exploring, thinking about culture, gender, accessibility, geography, language, all of it. And that, for me, is what we should be talking about, rather than decolonisation as a term that means very specific things to very certain groups of people. So, Eero, over to you for some questions.
Yes, we've got quite a few quite interesting prompts and reactions to what you've gone over, Katie. So let's start with this one. What do we mean by decolonize? Are we voting more yes because we want it to be that way, because we know it's the right thing to do, even if it isn't feasible?
Wow. That is a good question. I will open up if anybody wants to admit to this question or anybody has a comment on it. Do feel free to raise a hand and we'll hear from people. For me, I think there is an element of saying yes because it's what we want to happen, or it's an agenda that is very much in the forefront of education at the moment. I am yet to be convinced that it is I'm yet to be convinced that it's feasible. But if anybody has any suggestions, I'm more than happy to hear them. Iro, do you think it's feasible?
I mean, yes, feasible within specific context. I mean, from the work that we do, Katie, together, at college, from the amount of time we've been working together around anything and everything to do with inclusivity and representation, we know that it's a very challenging remit, and it takes a lot of different stakeholders having equal buying into the propositions that come out of any sort of decolonization or inclusivity initiative, right? Because it takes a lot of culture change and a lot of kind of quite radical, I guess, in some ways, change to anything and everything that has to do with learning and teaching, from the bibliography and reading lists that are recommended in modules and courses, to the examples that we use to talk about our disciplines. It is feasible, but it's not something that can be an isolated thing. I think it needs a lot of coordinated action, I guess.
I see a hand, and I think Melanie was hand up first.
Hello, thank you so much for the provocation. I really I enjoyed it a lot, and I appreciate the approach taken as well to kind of just get us all thinking and asking questions. But in terms of this question that's been asked, and kind of even just the feedback so far, I do like to be a bit of a stick in the mud with this. But I think we need to kind of go back a step. And you mentioned it earlier, Katie, in terms of the fact that in your definition, or the dictionary definition of what decolonisation is, and you spoke about the fact that colonization happened in so many different ways by so many different peoples at so many different times. So I think we need to go back a step and ask the question, whose coloniality are we trying to decolonize first before we start to say, can we decolonize? And so for me, particularly when I'm writing or doing work around this, it's answering the question, well, in my experience and the work that I'm trying to do, the decoloniality I'm trying to work with in higher education is that of British imperialism, because this is the context that we educate in and oftentimes educate from. But if we don't understand whose coloniality we're trying to decolonize, then I feel like we're kind of just flailing our hands at the wind in one way. And then understanding whose coloniality we're trying to decolonize, or whose decoloniality we're really looking at, that then gives us very specific starting points in terms of the curriculum, in terms of education, in terms of what the colonial legacies actually look like. And then then you can ask that question of, then can we decolonize? Because it's then unpicking that particular coloniality and those particular colonial legacies potentially. So I think going a step back and asking whose coloniality are we trying to decolonize might help have a bit more of a tangible approach to decoloniality in higher education.
Absolutely. And that's the kind of thing I want to get at by asking these slightly challenging questions is, you know, what is the right thing to do? Where is the right starting point? You know, and how do we get to those starting points?
Katie, I think kind of building on this discussion, the next question, I'm just going to put it on the screen now, might be a good way forward, because we're talking about feasibility and what's possible and what isn't, and how we should be approaching this. So this comment came quite early on in your presentation. Full decolonization is impossible, as to do so is to risk removing thought that has driven fields forwards and creates an artificial sense of meaning, infantilizing underrepresented groups. Just to throw that in there.
I don't disagree with any of that, actually. It's a very insightful comment. But I will ask, is it Ahmed who has a hand up? And Fazil, if either of you want to
yeah, it's Mushrat Ahmed Landayu.
Sorry.
Thank you. I know it's my surname's coming up first. I do apologize. Thank you for the provocation, and I'm going to build upon the first speaker. So it's really important that context is put in place as well as understanding what are, whose whose coloniality are we discussing. So here in the UK, we are in the metropole, in the land of the colonizer. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about it in the context of the UK, that's where we're springboarding from. But also, decolonisation is like a final point. And actually, what's happening is decolonising. And I say decolonising because it's an ongoing process, because racism hasn't gone, right? Discrimination hasn't gone, right? It's still here. So what we're doing is we're abating coloniality. And if you think about racism, for example, is waste coming into the system of education. What we're trying to do is keep that waste to a minimum, because we cannot get rid of it, because it is there in society and it leaks into education. And the other thing that's really important is that when we're talking about decolonizing, and decolonizing is an approach, it's not the only approach, right? It's just an approach. And what we're also thinking about is not getting rid of what has got us to this point, the knowledges and the ways of knowing that has got us to this point, but we are asking to explore why is it that we still have racial hierarchies in education? Why is it the terrain in education still has people who are racialized as black and brown and minoritized in the lower paid jobs in education? And as you go up, the color bar becomes whiter, right? If these still exist, and we've tried inclusive curriculum, we've tried the control and compliance of EDI, here we are trying something that has not been tried. And the word decolonizing creates emotion, creates tension. Yes, so what? Being a part of racism is also tensile. Let's try something different. And this is what decolonizing is, an approach, not the only approach. And decolonizing is not just about representation as well, because we know, look at the government, we have the most diverse government, and yes, it is still putting out fascist rhetoric. So, we've got to think about this a bit more critically than just saying decolonization. It is decolonizing, and it is not the only approach, and it's not getting rid of anything that has got us to this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to throw a spanner in the works as well, I'm just going to show a question that follows on the debate, I guess, in this. Let's see. Yeah, it's unfortunate that very often this topic gets coined in a racial content. Do you agree that this position often deflects from the argument, or in most cause becomes the reason to not debate?
I have a feeling, Eero, you've put that question up because you know what I think on the matter.
No.
I, as Eero is quite well aware, I would like to look at inclusion and inclusive teaching and learning as a holistic approach across racial, cultural, sexuality, gender lines as a whole piece. So I do tend to agree that the fact that it is often racialized and it is often used to talk about geographical issues is for me a barrier to it becoming potentially, yes, from reading this question, yes, it deflects from the argument, but I wouldn't say it becomes a reason not to debate. I think it just makes, I would like to see the debate widen, I think, across contexts. From my own personal perspective, when I ask the question, if you see yourself in academic literature, it's incredibly unusual for me to see someone from a homosexual background visibly carrying out academic work, which I realise is a whole host of different issues from the racial aspect, but it is still there. There is still a lack of visibility in LGBTQ plus people in academia. And I've just seen a lot of hands go up. I have no idea who's, Teams are telling me which hands went up first. Again, I'm going to apologise because I don't know which is the first name and which is the second name on these. So, Fazil Sabanda?
Hi, it's Fezile. Hi, everyone.
Sorry, Fezile. Hi.
No worries. Thanks, everyone, for your contribution so far. It's really like a stimulating discussion, and it makes me think whenever I, am in these spaces and we discuss these things, whenever I think about the word decolonisation itself, I think we often don't talk enough about the distinction between decolonisation and decoloniality. So in my understanding, decolonisation is more sort of the practical, okay? So either removing a power or adding, perspectives, whereas decoloniality is more ideological, right? It's about the colonized mind. It's about how these things manifest in terms of who you are, how you feel. It's almost like somatic in some sense, the body and the mind collective together. So I think that was the first point which I wanted to make in terms of, is decolonisation feasible? Yeah, of course we can add things to reading lists. Actually, decolonisation is more feasible. It's decoloniality which is the barrier, which like is causing us to hit this road each time we implement these things within our institutions or wherever we are. It's the ideological stuff that is blocking us, and until we acknowledge that, we're going to see the same things reproduced. And I suppose in terms of your last point, again, thinking about coloniality, not just colonialism, but coloniality, right? That was not only a racialized thing, but a gendered thing, a thing that perpetuated inequalities in terms of disability, a thing that really divided communities. So in terms of thinking about decolonisation, we need to think about coloniality and what that perpetuated and the types of social hierarchies that, propagated and perpetuated, not only in, colonized spaces, but here as well, in the metropole somebody was talking about. So yeah, I think it's both, and we need to sort of form these distinctions and see what ways we can start to disrupt coloniality in our day-to-day. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I suppose this is kind of, if it's the issue of language and the language that we use, and how decolonisation and coloniality are very, very similar words, but as you've just described, they're fundamentally different in meanings. And it's really hard for everybody to have a shared understanding of these words, which are oftentimes used interchangeably and used in different contexts. So I think you're absolutely right in what you said, but I think there is still a small issue in making sure that we all use the same language around the subject. Hero, I want to speak face on.
No, I was wondering maybe before, because the rest of the questions that we have on Mentimeter are kind of taking the discussion elsewhere. Perhaps you might want to take a couple more hands.
I am really sorry. Whoever is next on the list, it's chopped off the whole name, so I can't. Sarah. Hello. Sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, can.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I do agree with the speaker that spoke about racism and discrimination. I feel that every time the word racism and discrimination is brought up, people kind of step back and say, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's not what it is. And I think in this context, we need to discuss it and have this open approach to it. Otherwise, things are not going to be heard. And it's important that everyone's views are heard. Now, when we think about racism, it's basically a belief that different races possess distinct characteristics and abilities and qualities, which makes them either inferior or superior. And when you think about discrimination, it's basically the act of making those distinctions between people and treating them differently based on those distinctions. And so therefore, I don't think that you can talk about decolonisation without talking about those aspects as well, because no matter what we say, they come hand in hand. I come from a background where I have schoored in Africa and I've schoored in the UK, and I know the differences that I saw, and we should not deny that. There are differences in the UK, okay, and those differences need to be accepted first of all, because otherwise nothing's going to change. And then we need to accept those people who feel that they're being treated differently, their experiences, and how we can address those differences. Otherwise, we just go round and round in circles and nothing is going to get done and nothing's going to be achieved.
Is decolonisation the answer to that?
Well, if that is not the answer to that, what is the answer to that? And that's what I want. That is what I would want to know. If there's another suggestion, fine, because obviously we should all be open to suggestions. That's how we learn and grow.
I think I can put something up on the screen by way of kind of continuing this conversation around what is it, where should we start? So this one came under the challenges discussion. This person understands decolonisation as the concept as a process rather than a state. They don't believe the state of decolonisation is attainable, but the process of decolonisation is essential, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and I think that's generally like what we're hearing from the audience is that, and I suppose that's kind of the key to a lot of this, isn't it? There is no final end point on any of these discussions, be they gender, sexuality, racial. We have a huge amount of work to do to make the situation better for everybody. And if there is the utopian endpoint where everybody is considered equal, I don't think we're going to see it in any of our lifetimes, unfortunately. So yes, it's definitely a process, and a process that we need to undertake and hear everybody's arguments and figure out a way forward.
Yeah, and kind of in addition to that, decolonisation is an endpoint, and that is impossible when the foundations are corrupted. The fundamentals need to be dealt with. What we are striving for, decolonising an ongoing process. So there's kind of continuity idea.
Okay, so then I have a question for you, whoever might wish to answer it based on that. I am absolutely not going to dispute that the foundations are corrupted, but how do we address that? What do we do to redig and reset those foundations?
I put that there. It's Mushrat.
Hi.
And it's the kind of utopia case scenario is we rebuild education again in a reimagined way, but that's not reality. And if I look at what's happening at our university, we had a long discussion with lots of different stakeholders, the community that our university is within, the students, the staff across the board, and we decided to take a decolonising approach because we've tried EDI, we've tried inclusion, we've tried anti-racist approach, and we end up in the same place with the racial hierarchies and the racial awarding gap continuing. So we just started on reimagining in our context, what does decolonising approach look like? And it's multiple levels of work. We started with what decolonising says is work with the very people that are harmed and work with them in collaboration. And it's not exploitative, it's not extractive, because we are paying everyone who comes to the table. And we are not working with them in consultation, we are working with them in collective co-production. And that's difficult and hard and makes it slow, but we feel we've not done that as an institution. And we didn't start with white teams telling us what it is that should be changing. We looked at everybody's ideas, everybody's viewpoints, and we are coming to consensus slowly. Difficult conversations, painful conversations, not easy conversations, but we are trying to reimagine. Radically reimagine, because we've tried so many things and we still end up in the same place.
Yeah. My hand has been up for quite a long time. Can I?
Yes, of course. I was just going to get to that.
Yeah. That was just linked to the last thing you said. I don't know. We said a few things after that. When you said, Katie, that you will be more, I don't know if you say you'll be more comfortable, I'm just paraphrasing you, if decolonizing was more of a wider context where everything is included. And you mentioned homosexual working in academia. But I think that is part of it. I am an African, I'm from Guinea and I am gay. And I came to a realization that my gayness was a problem because of people that colonized me. It wasn't my ancestors. So that's the point I think we are missing. Sexuality is also part of it. So when we say to widen it, I think we are missing the point. That's what we're talking about. When we're talking about a woman being oppressed, is coloniality. When we're talking about Black people being racist too, is coloniality. When you talk about gay people being oppressed, is coloniality. My ancestors gave me space because I've learned those things. I've went back in my country, spoke to older people. And yeah, so if I was gay at that time, I would still be a professor and it would have still been okay. I think including you and all of us that feel different, that feel like we've been oppressed. So I think we are missing the point when we simplify or narrow down decoloniality to a racial thing. When you bring race in it, then you bring in everything else in it. Because people that are called Black and brown were okay to be gay in their ancient cultures. The white people that colonized us made it a law. And up to today, those laws are killing people in our country. In my country, in institution, it's a Western law that was put by our colonizers. They removed it in their own country, and those laws are killing our gay people in our country today. So we are missing the point if we think that homosexuality isn't also part of decoloniality. When we bring race, we bring in all of that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, yes, I completely agree with you, and it is, I suppose, my aim is to kind of encourage the concept to be thought of in a much broader way, because it is. Iro and I did a version of this presentation for colleagues of ours, and the conversation was almost exclusively around reading lists and making reading lists more representative of a global space. So we need more voices like yours that are saying that colonialization is more than just the geography. So yes, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Conscious of time, and Julie, you have had your hand up for a long time as well.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I raised the question about being able to finding that race becomes a distractor to the topic of decolonization. And having observed what happened in the last couple of minutes, I saw how it actually was a deflector of what was very, very important here. And I've seen things that looked like decolonization cannot solve the racist problem. This is just a comment I need to add. Decolonization cannot be a solution for racism. But every time the word decolonization is mentioned, there is always a tendency that it will be an attack on a particular type of people. And I think we need to separate decolonization from people's own agenda. Because I think ideally you want to be able to talk about it and really solve the problems that exist for decolonization. Why are we here? Because we genuinely have a problem. And we have a problem with the next generation in education. And how many years on, we still have not solved the problem of the next generation in education. We're continuing to do the same things we have done year after year after year, and we are failing those kids. So I think it's important that when we look at this agenda of decolonization, that we work to get an education that is fit for the next generation. And I mean, yes, when we do that, we will take on board the different cultural differences, the gender. But if we do address it as having a curriculum that's fit for everyone, then we will be inclusive. But the general things that happen, the minute you mention decolonization, and yes, quite a lot of the senior people are white, and they are, personally, will see it an attack on them. So we have to find some way of saying to them, it's not an attack on you, is that we're trying to find something that works for the next generation, not you. That's my contribution.
I think that I'm just going to check with Marissa how we're doing for time. But
we have about 15 more minutes.
Oh, we've got another 15. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure whether we were on 45 or the full hour. Okay. Hero, next.
Yes, I think now, given how much time we've got left, it might be a good time to sort of start framing the conversations that everybody so kindly has contributed up to this point, back to the work that you've done, Katie, as part of your research, because we've got a couple of questions that have come in relation to that. The first one is, going back to your definition slide right at the beginning, it would be good to hear your thoughts on the common themes and differences right at the definition stage, just to set the scene. And the second question following that would be, how did you get to 22 reasons? Because there weren't any identifiable ones in the presentation.
This slide. I'll just leave that there for a second while I answer that how I got to 22. I did a chunk of research reading through legislation documents and institutional help guides for inclusive learning. I wrote everything down, pulled everything apart and stuck them back together again. And there were 22 recommendations which came out of that. Some of them are sort of implicit in the headings that I've used, but a good number of them were really pedagogical, like, you know, make your assessments varied, share pre-sessional content, make sure everything is accessible. But part of my research also was to work with colleagues and staff at our institution to look at how feasible it was to implement some of these recommendations. One of the recommendations that came up as being a wicked challenge of, yes, we should, but we don't know how, was to diversify your curriculum. Very much chosen the word diversify rather than decolonize, because for all the reasons that we've already discussed, I think it's important that we look at it from all aspects, and that's kind of where this has come from, and why I want to further explore decolonisation or diversification, and that one of the other aspects that came out of my research was about language and how emotive language can be, which we've seen today. And I want to look at ways of, as the last speaker just said, ways of removing the emotion from these discussions so that there is no challenge to anybody other than to challenge the system and kind of make it more appropriate for everybody in it and for the next generation, because I believe that we as higher educators have a huge responsibility to the next generation, because they will be the ones that are making policy decisions in the next 20, 25, 30 years. And we have to prepare them to make better policy decisions, I think, than have been made in the past. But also to pick up on some of the other comments that I've made, a big part of my research and continuing to do it and moving forward is looking at the historical context of higher education and how we got to the situation that we're in. So I really do understand the comment made about difficult foundations, and I am definitely beginning to understand the problems with those foundations. But unfortunately, as I think we're all kind of very well aware, finding answers to changing it is incredibly difficult. Anyway, that was my executive summary of my my thesis. But looking at these definitions, I was really heartened to see, particularly challenging the status quo, making education fit for purpose, as coming up, because I think as we've discussed, decolonisation can be a bit of a loaded term, and that makes it difficult to have non-emotive conversations. But I'm really pleased to see that at least underneath the language, the nuanced language that doesn't necessarily make sense, that you know, there is a strong feeling that it is about challenging and changing. But now I can't remember what the question was and why I put this slide back up.
Just to hear your definitions, your thoughts and kind of comparisons in terms of the different definitions. Where do you stand in relation to these? But I think you've summarized it quite nicely, and in relation to the research that you've done. Being mindful of the time, and I think it might be a good point as well to invite some kind of closing contributions from yourself, Katie, and from the audience. I'm just going to put this question up. What does the end point look like? How do we know when we have reached this? And given that it is a very multifaceted conversation with lots of different angles and areas for input, how might we know what we're looking for so we can start working towards it, I guess, is a paraphrasing of the same question.
I think for me, and I would absolutely welcome anybody in the audience that wants to share their thoughts on this, but for me, the end point is the point where we stop having these conversations. But the need for these conversations and the need to look for ways to rebuild poor foundations and to change our content to make it fit for purpose for everybody. The end point is when we stop needing to have those discussions. When, you know, there is no need for a lecture series on decolonisation, when there is no need for me to research inclusive education. That's my end point, I think. Karen.
Are we allowed to just quickly add something? Are you still taking questions? You sound very eager. I just wanted to say I absolutely agree. I think, you know, the end point is when we no longer have racism, from my point of view, and let's hope that there's going to be a time when that is. I'm not sure there is, and I don't think, even if we go for an anti-racist university, whatever that means, I still think that we need to be asking these questions, because otherwise we'll go backwards. We won't stop, we'll go backwards. And I think if these questions are challenging, if these questions are raised, challenging questions that make us think, what is it that we're doing and why are we doing it and who decides, then for me, bring it on. I'm sorry if I sound so. Yes, we should come up with a whole load more, because we should always be doing that when we're thinking about our teaching and how we can help to enrich and enhance all our students to take on the challenges of the future as well as the present. I'm going to go mute, because obviously I'll keep going.
I don't.
We've got a couple more hands maybe that we can take, Katie, before we. Yeah. Oh no, once Karen's. Lonsini?
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Please tell us your name.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's Lonsini Kurma, just like you said. Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I think. How do we know we've achieved it? I don't think that's the question. I think the question is to focus on doing the work. And what I mean by that, and always thinking about decoloniality as reinstating our humanities. Anybody and everybody that feel like it's taking something away from you of your full humanity in living in your body and your mind in the way you want to. Either you are gay, either you're black. I'm bringing the gay thing up again because of Katie, because of homosexuality. You feel like you need to be more open. It's always open, and it's putting that. Once we gain in that, we will know. We will start gaining our full humanity, and all of us, right? And that's what we should focus on than looking at the end game, because it's a long work. And for me, in the context of my research, I am focused solely on Western coloniality, because that's what we are all talking about. And we could talk about it in a wide, we could wide decoloniality to colonization being done by other people. That's not what it's about. I think we all can agree that we're talking about the Western one. It's just one focus. And to do that, in my aspect, I think somebody mentioned that we need to keep on having conversations. And I think when we say that sometimes, how I feel, I think we've had enough conversations, especially when Black and brown people are together. We're always talking about these things. We're having enough conversations. I think what we think like our white counterparts are afraid to learn or haven't learned enough. And when it comes to that, then more conversation need to be had. I don't know how that could be, because what tends to happen, you realize people are afraid of really engaging themselves. Because my analogy is it's like taking a red pill. Once you take a red pill, you have to unlearn and you have to relearn. And that's how it looks like to a white person, right? And that's what we've been doing. And it's inviting white lenses to come to it. Yes, you have to unlearn and relearn. That's what the work is about. for us to get there. I think that's what we don't talk about enough. Why people are not learning enough about these things, because it's quite simple. Let's just be real. We are talking about reinstating people humanity here. Either you're gay or black or whatever it is. It's simple. There is a huge history. There's enough writing that have exposed this reality. Western imperialism, right? It's about white people, whiteness facing it, so we could all do something about it. I probably went too long, but yeah, that's my thoughts.
No, not at all. I just wanted to add something as well, and I'm fully appreciative of the irony at the moment that you've got two people from Imperial talking to you about decolonization. You know, that just makes it all the more interesting. But also, following on from the points you've raised, Lonsony, I find that when we're looking at the racial angle as well, it's so much more of perhaps white people not necessarily wanting to do the work independently and always almost relying on people from ethnic minorities or underrepresented groups to educate them almost, which is exhausting. I mean, I'm assuming it must be exhausting. Why not kind of meet people halfway? That's just my kind of final thoughts on this.
Yeah, my thought even is when you try to have a conversation, you want to look at the person's eyes and know that they're comfortable with you, because it's a dialogical sharing. You are having a conversation. You don't want to talk to somebody that you're making uncomfortable by just telling them your reality.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. So I can train you how to take those realities, but I can tell you, but I also don't want to feel uncomfortable telling you those realities. I think that's a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Katie, with 2 minutes to spare, perhaps you want to close the whole session?
Not often I'm lost for words, is it? I think the major thing I want to pick up on, and it's been said a few times now, is humanity, and I think fundamentally that's what this is about. It's about making sure everybody has humanity, and for all of those groups which are underrepresented or repressed for whatever reasons, that their humanity, I'm so sorry, that was the doorbell, their humanity is returned to them. But also, as Lonsony's just said, that those of us that are pushing, those of us that are having those conversations, remember that, yes, sometimes the people we are talking to need to feel uncomfortable, but if we make them feel uncomfortable too much, then we're undoing our own work. So we've got to have humanity in the way that we do this as well. Otherwise, we won't take everybody we need to take with us. And that's my final thought.
Brilliant. Thank you. Some powerful discussions that have happened during this whole provocation. And thanks, Katie and Ira for facilitating that, and thanks everyone else for contributing, both in the chat but also in the actual session out loud as well.
Thank you to everybody for being so open and honest with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, really good. Fantastic. Well, we'll finish up there. And we hope you can join us for some of the other lectures and provocations and roundtables that are happening later in the series as well. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.